Thanks very much, Katina, and thank you very much to Erin and Jacqueline, because you're making my life a lot easier now with my presentation. And I'm going to just share my screen. It's very thought-provoking what we heard so far, because what it demonstrates that accounting is really a menace to social consciousness. That's how I read it and how I see it, because when you think about the use or abuse of accounting by accounting practice in particular, they're sort of like, they have a nation, they try to do things in a particular way. But I'm not going to talk too much about accounting, but I'm going to talk a bit about some of the ideas that I've been thinking about for the last few weeks, and there was an aha moment last weekend. So I thought I would share this with you. Maybe I was a bit spirited in doing that, but I hope you forgive me for any incoherence or any ideas that might be a bit underdeveloped. I'm going to start, my discussion will sort of like look at a certain timeline to help me just with my thoughts and bringing the ideas together. Fundamentally, for me, I see the world in terms of resource allocation, which is what accountants really do. We try to always allocate resources according to a little formula, basically, that is beneficial to the owners of capital or the people that are investing in the firm, which is the nature of being, so to speak. But this, of course, becomes a bit problematic when we start using that framework as a moral grounding to what we think, how we think the world should be. And we've seen the Great Depression hit, and of course, what we've seen there was, despite the highest perhaps unemployment, especially in the US, by comparison to other countries, especially in the West, capitalists at the beginning were, hell bent on, keeping their high prices, and just, they would rather not sell their produce, etc. And then, of course, the government had to intervene, because suddenly the government started to become a bit conscious that workers, farmers started to think socialism is sort of like is maybe more appealing. And that's when the government started to get in and started to, tax the rich, bring in pensions, unemployment benefits, insurance, etc. And in a way, of course, that was one of the responses to the Great Depression. There were 4 responses, which in a way shaped history, and our history really that we're even living today, because we're still reeling from that point in time, I think. Military dictatorships, of course, in Central America and Argentina, and that was, of course, because the West, the industrialized West, was not able to buy the produce, and of course, drop in demand was problematic. And of course, social unrest means you get military juntas coming in to maintain the order. Fascism and militarism, we saw it in Germany, Italy, and Japan. And I don't need to go on about that. I think pretty much we are conscious of it. But it was interesting for me to know that, or at least get to know that actually Mussolini's rise actually happened even before the Depression. So you start thinking, okay, something is it something within the nature of the culture, or is it something beyond that, or is it just a function of the times? Japan, of course, invaded Manchuria and parts of coastal China in order they can relieve the impact of the Depression in Japan. And of course, Hitler thought, okay, I'm going to get in, no labor unions, restructures the industry, and created sort of like monopolies. and his high military sort of like program, rearmament, meant there was almost no unemployment. Each of these, they dealt with the problem as they thought, if we think about it in accounting terms, I thought it was the way to be. And of course, there is, of course, a lot of underlying hate, underlying dehumanization of the other that comes in. And of course, we saw even that in totalitarian communism. When it came in, and Stalin, of course, took advantage of it with his planned economy and industrialization and the sending people to the gulags during the Great Purge. And then welfare capitalism in France, UK, and Canada, which kind of eased things, and kind of these countries still sort of like calibrate this welfare capitalism to some extent. The Great Depression is important because it also made us realize that socialism was on the radar of the government, and government started to think, we need to do something about this. And in 1947, when the CIA was established, basically it was established to undermine the social system. So it was a bit of a propaganda sort of like machine for the government, if you think about it this way. I mean, I found it interesting that they actually went on to buy the rights to Animal Farm in order they can produce film where they would leave out the capitalist humans and just leave the communist pigs in the film as a reflection of how bad communism was. And of course, in 1984, and that was, I think, in 1949 when George Orwell published 1984, suddenly we come across this Newspeak, which it's a language that was highlighted in his book as the language of the ruling party and so on. And we can kind of see that reflected a bit in today, even when you sort of like read sometimes newspapers and so on, you think, it's almost like you're reading the same repertoire, the same narrative, and then you think, is this a coincidence, or their use of the certain terminology is intentional? And then, of course, in 1953, we started to see more of an engagement by the US, especially with the Muslim world, when Eisenhower invited Islamic luminaries to the White House. And then, of course, that was in July. And then in August, of course, there was the CIA Iran coup d'etat. And of course, you start thinking, okay, how is this going to evolve? And of course, the Iran coup d'etat was not the first coup d'etat, was not the only coup d'etat. It was almost like, because of the nature of its success, suddenly it became like a blueprint for other coup d'etats and, of course, other color revolutions that came afterwards. And the CIA, since then, were funding, of course, discreetly, national student associations, other people in other countries that might, be relied upon in terms of resistance and instigating a coup d'etat. And then we started to see there was a bit of a scandal, especially in 1967. And then about the CIA financing, basically, the National Student Associations, US. And of course, it came out. And it came out also that the CIA was also financing other people abroad. And of course, when you think about the real human cost associated with that, who innocently perhaps cooperated with the agency's front organizations, were tarred really with their CIA affiliation when the truth came out. And ultimately, I think the truth always comes out. In the 70s, we have this guy, a brilliant researcher, who joined the Center for international affairs at Harvard. And he was invited by Schelling. Schelling was one of the people during the Cold War thinking about non-violent ways to destabilize other countries and how to sort of like break the system from within. And he got a Department of Defense, I think, contract for funding for Gene Sharp. And Gene Sharp, of course, produced one of his famous, I think, books is From Dictatorship to Democracy, and the Sharp Dictionary of Power and Struggle. And basically came up with 198 non-violent methods and 997 glossary terms. When you look at these methods, you start thinking, I can kind of see that it's quite an interesting listing of things that we're kind of familiar with. We've seen it before. It's not unusual, especially, let's say, through unionism, through obviously resistance to, by boycotting certain social events or social disobedience, etc., or withdrawal from social institutions. So these methods, he documented them in great detail, and his 997 glossary terms were brilliant because he kind of defined exactly what they mean. And I started to think, okay, and I remember seeing in our Australian Parliament House, politicians, whenever, let's say, someone from the opposition is talking, or the presiding government, let's say minister or prime minister, they used to turn their backs on one another. I started noticing that, I think, around the time of probably John Howard, sort of like late 90s, early 2000s. And it kind of, bugged me always. I thought to myself, what is that? And of course, sure enough, when I stumbled upon Gene Sharp's work, I realized that it's actually methods of nonviolent protest and persuasion. And of course, one of them, turning one's back, which is basically silent disapproval, emphasized by turning one's back, whether standing or sitting, to the person or persons who are or who represent the opponents. And then you start thinking, is that the way to run a government or our parliaments? I mean, it's almost like, when you don't allow someone to listen, if you don't listen to someone, don't allow them to talk, I think that's the worst things that can happen. And I remember years ago, we had this pompous foreign minister, Downer, and he used to always say, what you're saying is leftist, and I don't have to listen to this, and I don't have to answer this. And then you think, does that mean that anything that is going to be perceived of the left, or for that matter of the right, depending on who's the sitting government, we're not going to listen and debate issues just because they come from this side or that side, then what is going to be left to us? And of course, in the 80s, we saw neoliberalism sort of like, being pushed along by good old Reagan and Thatcher. And basically they, especially Reagan, decided to establish this National Endowment for Democracy, which was, of course, congressionally funded, and it was to promote democracy. And the idea was simple, really. It's basically they funded opposition groups against administrations that failed to adhere to neoliberalism or the US agenda. And of course, when you think about this net, you start realizing that much of its work that was done before was actually done by the CIA covertly. So this idea of high tax cuts, public servant cuts, deregulation, union busting, this is in essence what the neoliberalism is really about. And then, of course, the tech boom came in. So suddenly we inverted our methods of running our businesses. So instead of relying on lots of physical capital, working capital, etc., we started to move towards outsourcing our physical capital and working capital outside, get somebody else to do it if it costs them a lot cheaper than what we do. what it cost us. And of course, suddenly brand capital became king. And that's why perhaps you will find more students are going into marketing disciplines than perhaps, the old traditional disciplines. And of course, there is here, I'm going to go through this a bit quickly, and I don't want you to get too bogged down with the details, but fundamentally what happened with the resource allocation process, we started to see a degradation of human life because authentic, social, real life, so to speak, suddenly has been reduced. Accounting reduced it to having, which is basically the material exchanges of goods and services, and replaced it with its accounting representation. So suddenly you have the exchanges, and these exchanges between business to client, business to government, business to employee, into basically representations or contracts. And of course, by the end of everybody, engaging in an exchange and building on the previous exchange, suddenly the whole thing becomes almost mythical and separated from the real events. And of course, when you do that, then this transaction exchange, of course, is taking place on the stock market, which of course is required for capitalism to reproduce itself, because basically it's the events that take place in the marketplace, in the stock market, is what represents capitalism today, because it's basically this oscillation that is taking place, swinging between scarcity and abundance, like a pendulum. You're not even sure where sometimes you are. Sometimes I listen to news and I think to myself, what are they really saying? And of course, once we have this oscillation, in essence, you suddenly retain no reference. You're not sure even where you are. You cannot really tell where you are. And of course, this means that even today, about even the reality of, the COVID thing, sometimes I listen to the news and I'm thinking, what are you saying? How bad is it, or how good is it? And you cannot really tell. And of course, part of that is to create this, I think, economy of fear or a spectacle. It's a show, really. There is nothing really happening apart from a show. And of course, the more you get things happening quickly, and there is always movement and alternation, then you lose track of what's going on. And in a sense, our social consciousness, as some of you have already said earlier on, we're in a state of movement. We don't have time really to think about what happened, about the dead, about how many lives were lost, and it's scary. Even at the beginning of the crisis, basically in the UK and here in Australia, they were talking about, okay, if somebody is old, so to speak, above a certain age, we don't need to give them priority of coming to the hospital. And of course, this spectacle of that we are witnessing, of course, increases our ontological insecurity, which of course fuels demand for security. And that's why everybody's, always almost super conscious about security. And no wonder security services, private ones, have dramatically sort of like increased. So tech boom, neoliberalism, and then of course 2001 hit, war on terror, and then nationalism, xenophobia, populism started to kick in, and then the neoconservatives thought, right, we need to do something about all this, aggression that is being expressed against us. And that's when they started to really engage in aggressive regime changes. And Jean Charles became, their poster boy, and he did a lot of works throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And I think in 2011, I think it was post, the GFC, that he started to revisit and rethink his ideas. And he started to think maybe actually neoliberalism is not really working, because his biggest problem was, the concentrated power of the state. Because he thought, when you have a centralized state, it will create more, or it will inflict more terror, more tyranny, so to speak, on its citizens. But of course, what he didn't count on is the alternative, which is smaller groups, and how these groups can actually can create oligopolies and so on, like what we see in companies and monopolies. Uh, these groups are not necessarily going to provide more freedom and democracy, so to speak. And the other thing, of course, about neoliberalism is when you break down a system, you cannot really break down the military. The military is still in control, like what we've seen. I mean, the countries that gave way, the military always supported it, because the military colludes with, the business powers, the financiers, basically the financial backers within the country, and the other elites within the system. So the elites always kind of win from these kind of regime change revolutions, but the masses are not the main winners. Um, and one of the things that I've noticed and perhaps prompted me to start kind of putting these things together was the idea of the anti-China rhetoric that I started to really became cognizant of, especially around 2015, 2014, 2015, I think. And of course, until our present day. And of course, I thought, why is this sudden, interest in China? Why is China now is the bad guy? And of course, I thought maybe it's the One Belt, One Road initiative, because the One Belt, One Road initiative, which was launched in October 2013, have suddenly become bigger than Ben-Hur. And I think the fear was it might export perhaps some of the Chinese characteristics. I mean, I'm in China, and I can tell you now, I'm not sure what is communism. I've not seen communism. And I see, sort of like neoliberalism on steroids there. And I'm thinking always, I just want to see, communism, where is it? And of course you start thinking, okay, maybe the geopolitical changes. I mean, having 138 countries joining the One Belt, One Road, I think was unsettling. So anyway, so how to study this anti-China rhetoric was a bit of a challenge, because you have to read and go through different newspapers and so on. And I thought, maybe we can use a little bit of technology, scrape some of the websites, news websites, for relevant information to just a simple Excel table. And then for each entry in the Excel table, just search the text that matches the 198 methods of nonviolence action, or the 997 dictionary terms. So this means the actual text of each article would be scanned, and then I would assign, the method, as in the one from the 198 methods, or the dictionary item or term, to the Excel table entry that if I find it. So for every line, and maybe if I may just share something else on the screen here quickly. So for example, I downloaded all these articles that are kind of anti-China, so to speak. And then what I did was to look at the tables, and let me see if I have anything. No. Hang on. I think it's sorry. Okay, title date. So we've got the methods, and then here just one, just to illustrate that. So for example, the US recently, about 6 days ago, or 7 days ago now, decided to issue sanction warnings to the banks over Hong Kong crackdown. I must say I have not yet finished that sort of like little exercise, but I'm hoping that once I automate that process, then I would be able to simply, build a social network and look at the authors and the media source and try to and link them to the methods or dictionary terms to identify sort of like who seems to be influencing our opinion. And of course, I don't want to do that now. That's not what I wanted. So the blacklisting of traders, as I said, it's number 93 on the list of methods. Suspension of social and sports activities, that's number 60. And that relates to some news, I think, yesterday. Today, 21st of October, about Australian Parliament to debate Beijing Olympics boycott. But what I want you to note here is where these publications are coming from. They're coming from an outfit called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And these guys have been really drumming up a lot of rhetoric anti-China. So I started to study them and trying to understand why they're doing that. And then, of course, the best way to study an event is look at the money. Who is providing the money? And there is a lot of money coming from the US, which you would expect, okay, that's expected because we collaborate a lot with the US. However, the other ASPI sponsors are the problem, which are the foreign weapons manufacturers. And this is just a simple sort of like social network of their connections. So you've got few weapons manufacturers from Australia, but these are mainly not Australian really companies, are sort of like a representative of foreign companies. So you've got companies from the US, of course, Israel, Germany, France, Sweden, Spain. And of course, you start thinking to yourself, why would foreign weapons manufacturers would be interested in sponsoring an Australian think tank staffed mainly by ex-defense and ex-intelligence personnel? And of course, would that maybe explain ASPI's hostile narrative about China to drum up a bit of business for its funding masters? And sure enough, over the last 2 years, ASPI has been basically putting proposals for which weapons we should be, as the Australian government, so to speak, should be investing in. And sure enough, the lion's share goes to their funding masters. And of course, the other thing is, why do we have this also, within a bigger picture? Why do we have this, narrative about especially Muslims in China? I mean, around campus where I am, there are lots of vegan restaurants, a lot of vegan people that keep their beards, they have their mosques and everything. I'm thinking, and then of course you read sometimes the news and you think, where are they getting this news from? And of course, the BRI Alliance today has got 138 countries comprising 51.7% of world GDP, but they have 4, which represent 4.8 billion people, 61.7% of the world population. And 1.4 billion out of these, so nearly 30%, identify as Muslim. And of course, this 1.4 billion represent or comprise 87.5% of the world Muslims. So what is the best way to torpedo this Belt and Road Alliance? Antagonize the Muslims. And of course, I mean, at the time when, governments like, when I say governments, I'm thinking more about right-wing neocons suddenly caring about Muslims. I start thinking that doesn't add up. And of course, I thought, okay, maybe it's just all about money. I mean, after all, this is my bias as an accounting researcher. And of course, I could be wrong. Let me see. Maybe not. And I think I'm going to stop here. And I'm happy to take your questions. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't go over.
No, George, I cut you short 10 minutes and you've nailed it now. I think we'll take 2 questions from the audience. What you've uncovered is pretty frightening, but I do know you're a deep thinker and you do understand strategy. You also know accounting. You taught accounting. You also taught information technology, so you know your stuff. Comments or reflections from people in the audience? got comments saying powerful work, George, and thank you in the chat window from a number of people. George, are you challenging us, of course, as always, to
I mean, okay,
think where these sources are coming from?
I think, okay, I mean, we would be naive if we think, propaganda is unique to certain countries.
Mm-hmm.
We would be also naive that there are no financial interests. I mean, okay, if you scare the bejesus out of a country like ours, we're a small country, we're a big continent, but small country. And then what? We are spending now about, 270 billion on weapons,
Mm-hmm.
going to the same weapons manufacturers that are sponsoring some of our think tanks. And then you start thinking, is there something wrong with this?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, I don't believe that business interests are necessarily always in the national interest. I mean, that would be, I think, naive.
It reminds me of government-funded, non-government organizations.
Yes. So, I mean, okay, is it all just about good intentions? I don't know. I see the sort of like culprit here, and the culprit here, I think, is just great, if for the choice of a better word. And I think the other thing too is, yes, geopolitically, China's rise is amazing. But the other things that I always think about it, I think, okay, I like to see results. I've been in Australia now about 31 years. When I arrived in Australia, they were talking about this high-speed train. Today, they're still talking about it. 31 years ago, China didn't have any bloody high-speed trains. Today, we have it everywhere. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with us? China was poor, we were rich. What's wrong with, why are we just talking and not delivering, so to speak? And we see it in infrastructure, and it's always, we have more freedom and democracy. And you think, yes, but I'd like also practical things that would make my life easier. So when I'm on the train from Wollongong, as I used to go to Sydney and back, I don't spend 5 hours a day, So there is something not gelling, but I mean, I don't want to go into the bigger picture of the geopolitics of it, because it's still, I'm trying to find my way around it. It's not that clear, but I think it's predominantly about the money. A lot of it.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. I recently went on a podcast, George, where I spoke about one of the last projects I did in industry, which was after the bombing of Kabul. I was asked to go and do a high-level design back of the envelope for telecommunications mobile network. And I said, who are the competitors? Well, they were all North American companies that were being represented to rebuild the place that the US, for political reasons, had done what it had done. And so it was a very uneasy kind of job for me to do, but it was the last one I did in industry. So, but it made me realize, inverted commas, war is good, because you need to build things and create machines and rebuild and other things of this nature. So in closing, I just want to thank the audience. I want to thank the logistics team, Cindy and Melissa, who have stayed on beyond the 15 minutes extra I asked for. And George, for you as a researcher, for being able to touch these topics in the public interest and to give us your analysis, sound in methodology, but also I think you're brave. You've always been brave and not always been appreciated where you've been because of this, I do think. But I also appreciate, given you're working in China, I worked in China for many years until very recently. And I think these reflections are healthy for us to talk about in the open. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Diana. Toby Shoref, thank you. Dr. Robert Abbas and everyone else I didn't get a chance to mention. People had to run to pick up their children from school on DC side. Thank you, George, and may everyone have a wonderful week. We'll see you again in 2 weeks' time.